Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, we are again joined by our lovely friend Kathleen, and we are continuing the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. So, this is episode 10 of the series. So, definitely recommend checking out previous episodes to get a primer of what the point of the experiment was. But I would like to start us off with a few quotes by Dr. Ray Peat, because I think that it really brings this section that we are going to discuss today, kind of like brings it home in full circle for a lot of people. So today we're going to be reviewing chapters 28, 29, and maybe 30, talking about how the heart, the function of the heart changes when you are malnourished, when you are under eating for your needs. And like the heart keeps us alive, right? So that's kind of a scary thing to think about, but when you have these quotes from Dr. Ray Peat in your mind as we go through this section, I think you'll better understand why it's happening. So, Kathleen, I'd love your. I think all three of us have been very much impacted by the work of Dr. Ray Peat and his practices and principles, and what he talks about shows through on the results of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment time and time again. So, the two quotes that he's probably most famous for, quote, "The key idea was that energy and structure are interdependent at every level." And the other quote, "If we learn to see problems in terms of a general disorder of energy metabolism, we can begin to solve them." So I think that kind of puts us in the right frame of mindset, because you're going to see like there were serious things going wrong with the heart. And mainstream medicine would put that into, what's the branch of medicine that just deals with the heart?
Cardiology.
So that's a separate field of medicine, right? Separate from endocrinology, separate from the whole concept of metabolism, but like
neurology.
Wow, it's linked.
All of the. Sorry, there's a delay. Sorry, Tyler.
No, so all of those fields should be linked rather than separated. And I think that that's kind of the biggest thing. And so, Kathleen, what are your thoughts on how Ray's work kind of ties into what we've been discussing with the Minnesota Starvation Experiment?
Yeah, I think I mentioned last time about how Dr. Peat and Dr. Ling, Albert St. Georgi, like all of these kind of greats that Ray would refer to, talk about, etc., how in many ways, when I started to read their work, it was a huge weight off of my shoulders, because I was like, well, what do all of these things have in common? And all of these things have in common the energy production of the body. And so, okay, what does that? Well, the mitochondria. And it's like, okay, so now we go into, well, what feeds into the mitochondria? Like, what are they actually doing and stuff? And then that's when we get into things like glycolysis, fatty acid oxidation, so beta oxidation, alpha oxidation, amino acids entering the citric acid cycle itself, the electron transport chain, all of that. And when I started, and then from there, it's like, in order for us to produce hormones and neurotransmitters, that first step is happening in the mitochondria. So it's like, okay, well, that answers that part of it. In order for everything to kind of leave the cell, so neurotransmitters, hormones, etc., that requires the calcium oscillations, which requires the mitochondria. Like, so everything again kind of goes back to the mitochondria. And so I was like, well, let me just focus on these things. And that's, I think, what Dr. Peat did in many ways. Like, a lot of the things he talked about went back to the mitochondria, if he didn't necessarily like say that explicitly. And then that's when I started to actually get better and improve. And I wasn't like, okay, I got to attack this thing. And then, something that I see people do is they like go down all these different rabbit holes where they're like, okay, I have a GI issue. And so I like focus on the GI for like a week, and they're like, I'm going to do everything for the GI. And then they're like, oh, but I have this too. And so now I like focus on everything like here for a week. And then, so there's no consistency. Like we see this all the time when it comes to lifting and stuff, right? Like people are always program hopping and stuff. Well, I think that a very similar thing happens in the health world too, where people are like, okay, I go see cardiology, I go see neurology, I go see the gastro side, I go see, like you said, endocrinology, all of that, and we view it as separate things instead of focusing on, again, the foundation. And then from there, it's like, okay, once we've addressed the foundation, now we can start to address the kind of more higher order things that maybe the foundation, well, to be honest, I think the foundation covers most of these things if given enough time. But I understand that people feel like they need to be doing something, especially with this idea of learned helplessness, et cetera. And so I completely understand working on the foundation while addressing these other things using other modalities and stuff too.
So I think the biggest thing that you will see as we go through these chapters is the heart isn't functioning the same. There are noticeable differences between the control time period, which is when the subjects were eating a normal amount of calories, versus the semi starvation state. And then again, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment acts as a literature review as well. So they pull reports from the literature discussing other semi starvation states. And there's somewhat similar trends in, you know, the heart is still functioning, but it's not functioning optimally. And we have to go back to something that we talked about in a previous episode, which was the heart shrunk in size. The heart is a muscle. And when you are in a low energy availability state, you are losing, you're wasting muscle. And that's not just what we think of as like skeletal muscle on our biceps. Like the heart shrunk in proportion to the loss in body weight. So how can a heart that is shrunk in size function the same? It can't. And it can't function without proper energy. So Kathleen, do you want to get us started with chapter 28, circulation and cardiac function?
Yeah, and I just want to comment on what you said really fast. So people will say, well, the heart shrunk in proportion to, so it's not a problem, right? Because it was kind of one for one in a way. But that's definitely not what they see. So even though it might seem like, okay, well, it's in proportion to, that makes sense. It's a smaller body, you need a smaller heart. Like that's definitely not what they see. So yeah, I think the kind of like starting off the bat, they see bradycardia, hypotension, and the lowering of skin temperature, and frequently vertigo and slight cyanosis. So again, we talked about cyanosis. On the other hand, shortness of breath is seldom reported among starving people, and true signs of congestive heart failure without cardiac disease are rare. So they don't actually see like congestive heart failure, but even though they don't see heart failure, they see multiple symptoms related to the heart arise. And so they kind of question like, what's causing this?
Yeah. And I think the biggest trend, which is consistent amongst all the studies that they discuss and the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, is the lower pulse rate.
Yes.
And, you know, that's such a hot topic because people brag about how low their pulse rate is. And you'll see this in endurance runners, their pulse rate will get lower and lower. And that's because the body is like adjusting to that stress input, right? But that's not always a good sign. And this is something that Dr. Ray Peat brought to the table. So Dr. Rhoda Barnes discussed how assessing metabolism, you can do that through body temperature, but then Dr. Peat brought in, well, let's also bring pulse to the discussion too, because your pulse rate, it's not directly the reason for, but it is in proportion to the amount of hormones, including thyroid hormone and nutrient delivery to various organ tissues throughout the body. And so if you've got a lower pulse rate, that means that various organ systems are getting less nutrients, less energy, less things that they need to function better. And so I know that they presented quite a few reasons for why, but what do you think the main reason is the reduction in the pulse rate?
Well, so this gets into like, is the heart a pump? Is the heart not a pump? I think there's a lot of discussion we could have on that, but kind of, keeping to this, I mean, even just like what we've talked about in the past about the structure of the torso and the loss that they see in the structure of the torso. And so the change in pressure dynamics because of that alone, things like quote unquote leaky capillaries, like just leaky vessels in general. This gets into like the lymphatics and stuff too. The conservation of energy. So a decrease in non-exercise activity, movement. I think there could be multiple reasons that they see a lower pulse rate. But they say that rates as low as 30 to 40 beats per minute were often observed in bed rest, and the general level reported was less than 55 in almost all cases. And how many doctors do you go to, or like did I go to, where my pulse was low, my blood pressure was low, and not like rock bottom low, but like low, and the doctors are like, oh, you're great. Like, yeah, you must be an athlete, like keep doing what you're doing and stuff. And you're like, I don't feel like I'm an athlete. I'm like struggling here. Like, what do you mean? Like, I can't go run or anything like that. Um, so, and then they experienced tachycardia when sick. And I would also definitely experience that when I felt more stress, like when I would get sick and stuff, my heart rate would increase. But again, like it's a relative increase, right? Because like if your normal pulse is like a 55 and you jump up to 85, well, that's a 30 beat per minute increase. And 85 might be fine, but for someone that is normally at 55, that's an issue. Just like what we talk about with, temperature. If your normal temperature is like 96 and you jump to 99, well, you have a fever, or like, yeah. And then so they also see a shift to tachycardia in late stage as well. And this like just brings up so many things when it comes to things like dry beriberi, wet beriberi that people talk about with like B1 deficiencies and stuff. And again, I just kind of go back to, and even like late stage Lyme that people talk about. And I just kind of go back to this as like a center thing. They also see arrhythmias. How many people talk about that they have arrhythmias nowadays? Yeah.
So just like the biggest, as we go through all the different topics that they bring up, it's just like there's a lot of irregularities.
Right.
And honestly, it's frightening. And I think that this brings up like a really important discussion. When someone is in such a low energy availability state, they show this through the refeeding period, how dangerous it can be. Because when the heart shrinks 50%, the body's got to conserve energy. It's got to downregulate. It's got to keep itself safe. And so it shuts off certain things. And so if someone brings in a ton of food, that brings on a huge stress. And people don't think about, your heart and food intake, but all of these systems work together. Your cardiovascular system is working to help your body break down that food, right? It's related. And so numerous times throughout this chapter, they bring up the dangers and the fears in the refeeding stage. And what they see is a huge swing in the opposite direction with the pendulum. So if you've got someone in a low energy availability state, very under eating, undernourished, and then they go to refeeding, that puts a huge stress on the system, and they can see their heart rate go way high.
Right.
They can see all these irregularities in how their heart is functioning because it's a huge stress load coming onto the system that the body wasn't prepared for because it had to downregulate. And so this is something that we all really want to stress. Like if you are someone that is in a very malnourished state, it is advisable for you to seek help, and not in terms of like anything is wrong with you. It's just going to be beneficial for you to have more one-on-one support to monitor things as you're refeeding. And so if you are in a state like that, seeking out help is important. Unfortunately, we don't know of many people who work with this population of people. So if there are nutritioners or practitioners that are listening and are familiar working with people in a low energy availability state and wanting to help people get out of that in a safe way, in a safe refeeding, planned reverse diet way, please reach out to us, because we would love to like present that as an option for individuals that reach out to us.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, and refeeding is a well-known issue. Like even Dr. Longsdale, that so many people have read his book about vitamin B1, his and Dr. Chandler Mars's book about vitamin B1. Like he talks about how when people start even taking, the B vitamins, how they experience refeeding syndrome and how they have to go really slow. And how you see people, with hypokalemia and phosphate issues and iron issues and all this stuff. And, if you think about like the stress on the heart, for example, so you start refeeding, now you're like bringing in more liquids, and now the heart has to deal with that volume. And now you're also bringing in more like fats. And so, with the chylomicrons, the fats are directly entering into the lymphatics, and then the lymphatics drain into the whatever it's called right here, the junction right here. I forgot what it's called.
Yeah.
But it drains right into your circulatory system right there, and then goes right through the heart right there. You have obviously, food coming first past liver and then straight into the portal vein. So like you can see how if you, and even if it seems like the amount of food is not as much as you would have ate normally, if you're like, oh, I should be able to eat this on a normal day, I'm not like having a huge amount of food. Comparatively to what you were eating or what you were digesting, absorbing, etc., it is a lot of food. And so you do have to go slower. So yeah, again, like, I know I keep saying slow, but I truly mean like pedantically slow. Like if you think you're going slow, you need to half that rate and go even slower. Now, if you have like weight that you need to gain like acutely, or like you will starve to death acutely, like you really need to go get help, and you need to like have labs drawn every week, every other week, to make sure that you're not, really messing up your electrolytes, especially what we talked about last time with diarrhea, etc. Um, so the hard thing is, again, like, in our country, no one believes that this is possible. Like, no one believes in the first world that someone could be malnourished, especially if it looks like you have weight to lose, right? And again, like, how much of that is fat mass, how much of that is edema. Like, again, we already talked about the edema problem kind of at length, and we're going to talk about it in the future chapters at length as well, kind of when we get to the special topic section. So yeah, so there's a lot there, and it's kind of going back to like what potentially is causing the lower heart rate, the lower blood pressure. They talk about like the autonomic nervous system. We've discussed that when it comes to the GI, when it comes to like the sphincters and stuff. But like they would even give them, injections of things like uh, adrenaline and other things, and they didn't really see any kind of increase from that when the autonomic nervous system should respond to that. And it's what we talked about last time about how people in the States, they don't respond the same to exogenous hormones, even like exogenous like uh, um, sources that can be used to make neurotransmitters, things like tyrosine, etc. And even things like uh, digitalis, which is like a famous medication that they give for diuresis and stuff like that. Like they saw differing effects from that. So yeah, they see things kind of all over the place, and this goes back to like people in this state are highly sensitive to any change, right? There's like no robustness in the ability to kind of swing the pendulum, and we see this all the time where people are like, "Oh yeah, I started, I took this supplement and it like floored me, or like made me worse, or like I had such a crazy response to it that other people, they don't have this response to it." And it's like, well, because of this issue, like we don't have the robustness to kind of deal with big changes in our state.
And it's all survival mechanism, right? Like the body is recognizing, wow, my heart just shrunk. There's less energy coming in, or maybe the body is in a low energy availability state. It's not good at producing energy. There's low cellular energy production. It has to downregulate. And so as a result of downregulating, your body can only function in a small window of stress. And any sort of tipping outside of that causes just way too much disturbance for the body. And this is not natural, right? And so I think that this is honestly why we can see people in these very disordered eating groups appear fine.
Right.
Because if they function in this like narrow window of their day-to-day things, they know what to do, they stay in that lane, and they don't overstress themselves, they can appear fine because the body can function in that tight window. But like, that's not life. It's not living.
Part of being in that state, though, is finding comfort in a specific routine like that. And that might be wise because they can't handle anything outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do have oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, in the less extreme scenario, so let's say somebody's not like in need of hitting, immediate help, but they are dealing with a low pulse rate.
Yeah.
There's the standard recommendation in the more pro-metabolic space that your pulse should be between like 70, 85 to 90. It was somebody coming from the state of very low pulse, and let's say they're like comparing themselves to that general guideline of 70 to 85 to 90. What should they be looking for as far as maybe other symptoms or way that they're feeling to know if their pulse increased and it's a good thing, or if they push themselves too far and it's a bad thing?
And they're becoming like tachycardic and stuff. Yeah. For them. So I think it kind of goes back to the whole picture, right? So temperature, pulse. I really like to add blood pressure there too, because like a lot of the times your pulse will become tachycardic or bradycardic in order to like offset what's going on.
Those are fancy terms that I don't think. Like honestly, Kathleen, before reading the MSc, I didn't know what those meant. Yeah. So bradycardia is like low pulse rate, and then tachycardia is opposite, so high. So that it's above the normal,
right?
Or on either sides, but
then you have to consider the ranges and like what's normal for that person.
Right.
So I think that's what,
Yeah. So you could be tachycardic, but still be considered like normal or even potentially low to like a doctor, but like that's tachycardic for you. Or like you could be, you could have a low blood pressure, but be considered normal for them. It's always about the relative changes. That's why, like, people will say, oh, home blood pressure cuffs, there's a lot of error. Just like home, weight scales, there's a lot of error. And it's like, yeah, of course there's a lot of error. There's a lot of error in the doctor's office one though too. But what matters is like, if you are, normally like 120/70 and you're now like 97/50 for your blood pressure, well, that's a problem, right? We need to kind of investigate like what happened, especially if that dropped like acutely, right? And you're like feeling symptomatic from that and stuff. So temperature, pulse, blood pressure, how are you doing waking up in the morning? How are you doing falling asleep at night? Can you stay asleep at night? Do you have this kind of cyanosis or like pallor, kind of like ghost white color to you? How do you have brain fog? Like one of the quotes that they have in here is premature senility, which was ascribed to defective cerebral circulation, was unusually common in the starving Spaniards. And like, I remember there was a Facebook group that I posted in, and I was like, when I was starting to come out of this, and I was like, because I saw this article about younger, like millennials having pre-Alzheimer's. And I was like, I remember feeling like that. I remember feeling like I was going through some type of like pre-Alzheimer's where I had horrible short-term memory. My like long-term memory was there, but was fuzzy. And like even kind of some of the stuff that I experienced then, like a lot of it's kind of fuzzy. Like if anyone has ever been on a mag sulfate drip during pregnancy, that's kind of what it felt like to me. And like as I continually come out of the LEA state, like I have memories come back and stuff. And so I think that's like me being able to finally deal with some of the stuff that I went through and some of those memories back then and stuff. But a lot of people talk about how, they have brain fog or memory issues, or, a lot of people are being diagnosed with things like early onset Alzheimer's, et cetera. And again, I'm not saying that it's not possible that you have some genetic mutation or whatever that's causing the early onset Alzheimer's, that you have some family thing, but and until you address this, like, how do you know? And it's like, and to me, this gives so many people hope, because it's like, what if it actually is this? And what if you can like help reverse yourself, or at least stall the progress, by addressing this? So like, to me, this is like a very positive thing. And I hope people take it that way. And again, I'm not saying that it couldn't possibly anything else. And like, of course, like look at the other avenues and stuff too. But like, please also address this. And again, realize that this takes time, and I don't have a good answer as to why it takes time, other than like potentially cell half-lives and stuff like that. But it just takes time. So.
Well, I would say along those lines too, I would say the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, 24 weeks of semi-starvation, so eating 1,500, 1,600 calories. Well, a lot of diet camps promote that, right? And encourage that. People are on that for years.
That's for a male.
Yeah. So that's kind of longer term, but these results, the heart just not functioning right, down-regulating its size, pulse rate going down. You've got to think there's got to be some proportional changes happening when someone does a long fast and a refeed, long fast, refeed, long fast, refeed. And so, maybe you as an individual, maybe you are eating enough calories, but are you spreading that out in a way that actually makes sense for you, that can help you better manage these signals coming into the body? Are you that person that runs out the door, you don't eat until 6 p.m.? Hey, maybe stopping that type of structure and instead having breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe that can kind of help improve these metrics as well. So I think it's also important to consider, maybe you aren't the really under eating type, but you're doing this like fast binge. And that's got to have some sort of similar output, like results, than what we're seeing in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Granted, much shorter term, but like the biggest reason I see this being a problem is they have numerous times they talk about the cardiovascular problems during refeeding.
Yes.
And they say in the period of refeeding following severe undernutrition, the metabolic load on the body is suddenly much increased and a far greater circulation must be provided. And so it's like the atrophied heart can't carry the burden from that huge influx of feeding. And so again, Kathleen's message, go slow, potentially work with someone. And this is one of the biggest issues of people gaining the 20, 60, 80 pounds that you hear about people going all in or going pro-metabolic. Like that can swing the pendulum in the way opposite side, and you're going to get even more problems. And so going very, very slow out of these states and recognizing and understanding that it's a long-term thing. You're not going to see immediate results. I think that that's an important thing to have, so that way you set yourself up for success.
Yeah, and I understand like what we're saying. It's very hard to square. I understand that, because it's like so many people are saying the quick fix, and they're like, just do this diet or take this supplement or whatever, and you're gonna get the quick fix. And at it, the end of the day, I understand you're like trusting us, and I get that. And so like, don't trust us. Read the MSC, see if this like intuitively fits with you, and again, like explore those other avenues, but also do this along the way. Because we're talking about increasing calories like 5, maybe 10 a week, maybe every other week. So this is such a slow process anyways, that like you can continue slowly doing this while you're exploring the other things. That would be the big thing I would recommend. The only caution I would say is like, while you're exploring the other things, you don't want to push yourself so hard with those things, because you're like dumping all the minerals and all the B vitamins and all the supplements and stuff on top of you, that now your heart has to handle that, your liver has to handle that, your GI has to handle that. And so, go slow with those things too, is what I would say.
Yeah. And just like, again, those supplement lovers, you protein powder lovers.
Yeah.
They tested this in the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. So
right.
There was the semi-starved group, right? And then they reached the end of the 24-week starvation period. And then they started to do the rehabilitation, meaning increase in calories, increase in energy coming in. Guys, the vitamins and protein supplement group didn't recover better. In fact, they actually found that some of the heart functions recovered better without the vitamin supplementation. And so again, these are just like more and more variables that you're throwing at yourself that you may not be responding well to, but you don't know because you're taking a full stack of supplements instead of just focusing on whole foods, the whole food matrix, letting that increase in energy slowly come in and letting your body kind of figure that out, rather than dumping in a bunch. Like you said, an already shrunken liver now has to process all these other supplements on top of that.
Yeah, they say the men who received placebos made a better recovery in this respect than did those who received vitamin supplements. So, yeah. So they say, sorry, I was looking for this one quote. It is dangerous to keep starved people standing for long periods of time too. How many people do you see that they can feel when they're standing for long periods of time and they're like, I need to sit down? Or you see people just like leaned. I mean, I was that person. I was like leaned over. I remember like standing, watch on the bridge of the ship and being like, oh my goodness, because you're not allowed to sit down when you're standing and watch. And I'm like leaned over on like the chart table being like, at like 12 o'clock at night or whatever. So and then also like kind of back to the actual men that did the MSC themselves, like they experienced worsening heart symptoms as they were refeeding. And I understand that's scary too, because you're like, oh my goodness, what did I do? I'm like doing what I know I need to do, but I'm having these heart symptoms, and that's really scary. And I don't know what to do about that. And it's hard,
I think, Kathleen, that I wrote down, so in the semi-starvation state, they had the bradycardia, so
right.
Low pulse rate. And then they saw a sharp rise in the pulse rate in the unlimited feeding rehabilitation. So that's
right.
why the swinging in the opposite direction, I think that overshoot can be avoided if they go slow.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that was all I had for that chapter. It's a really good chapter. All of these chapters are really good. So
before we move on to the next one, Kathleen, can I go back to what you were saying about the Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
And like memory loss?
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you had a similar experience, but when I went through anorexia in high school, that was around age like probably 14, 15, 16. Now that I am like past the state of being, starved, I have frequent dreams of processing things that I don't really remember during that time phase, that specific time phase. So like in high school, the conflicts that I couldn't deal with then between like my friends, between relationships, and that is what my brain is now trying to process, almost like bringing back up when it seems so irrelevant in my life right now.
Yeah.
But it is constant, just dreaming about that time. And I just, after you said that, I was like, maybe it's my body trying to process what I literally shoved out, didn't have the space for, couldn't process, couldn't even remember. And now that I can, it's like, it's just cycling through that.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I think a lot of repressed memories and stuff, I think it makes a lot of sense why we do that and why it happens. And do you have the energetic, ability to deal with those things that are happening at the time and stuff? And yeah, like I'll have dreams, or I'll have like a scent memories, or like sound memories, feeling memory. Like it's really weird. They're not always like picture type memories. It can be a lot of different things. But yeah, it's very definitely interesting. So I definitely experienced that too.
I got a few more notes. I think, so another thing that they saw in like the rehabilitation phase, so the overeating, at a certain point in the rehab phase, they were allowed to just eat whatever. A lot of them saw like shortness of breath. So again, just showing that this like large increase in food, when you see a period of people doing rapid weight gain, like it's just going to lead to challenges on your body that your heart shrunk to not be able to deal with. And so again, going slow. And I think that they brought up some great like summary points at the end of chapter 28 of like kind of what happened. So they believe that the bradycardia is a protective to conserve the strength of the heart, conservation of energy. So the body is literally just protecting itself. And so they said, quote, the heart conserves itself by sacrificing the circulation to other tissues, notably the periphery. So, hands, cold fingers and toes, that white look where there's not much blood flow. And they said these individuals seem to function okay without any stressors. And again, it's important to remember that the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, they were really in a controlled environment, not a ton of stressors outside of like, I think they were in a very clean condition. So
they had to do so many like steps per day and exercise, and they had to do like a clerk job and stuff, but it wasn't like anything excessive.
Yeah. So that's pretty much chapter 28, showing the irregularity of heart output.
I kind of what you were just saying really fast. Like, I think people need to remember like the organs, the mass of the organs that we have as adults, we've been growing since we were babies, right? And then like there's a pretty big jump during puberty, but like during that entire time, it's slowly growing, right? And just like our skeletal mass, and we already know that like putting on muscle, it takes a long time. Like we're talking about like newbie gains for like a male is like maybe 0.5 to 1 pound per month at the first year, and then it starts to drop off as you're like starting to reach closer and closer to your genetic limit. Arguments on like, could you ever technically reach your genetic limit? It's like the taking halves, and like, could you ever half your way there? But anyways, so like in a very short amount of time, you lose a fair amount of organ mass. And to expect the body, like, yes, the body has like muscle memory, and that has an amazing ability to put muscle back on that has been lost and stuff. And I believe that's, given what we see with regular muscles, like I believe that's probably possible with the organs, but I have no data about that. But like, it's going to take time. And so again, like if you are in, not in an acute state, like, and even in an acute state, you still need to go slow, I think. But in that state, you need to be monitored for sure and like helped along with that. But if you're, in this state, you just need to go slow to allow your body to just like rebuild itself. Like you're like a baby again in a way, and you're like just rebuilding yourself again,
Well, and okay, so that's a really important thing. Protein is such a hot topic, and we all agree that protein is important because protein provides us the building blocks. So if you think of a log cabin, protein is going to serve as those logs, right? But what actually puts the log cabin together? And it's the labor,
Right.
the men, those building the log cabin. That's the energy. So like you need the energy to be able to hold those protein structures in place. And without that adequate energy, it's the log cabin's going to start to tilt. It's going to allow air, water in. It's not going to be able to be held as tightly close together. So that energy is important for not only rebuilding the organs, but also keeping that proper structure so that it can function properly.
Exactly. Yeah, so to start the next chapter, which is fainting and the cardiovascular response to posture, first thing, association of fainting with hunger is universally recognized. And again, I dealt with syncopes. How many people do you know deal with syncopes, fainting? How many people do you know deal with like dysautonomia, POTS type issues where like you go from how I'm sitting right now, I'm sitting on my knees or like laying down and you stand up a little bit too quickly and you start to like gray or black out. Like it's a huge issue nowadays. But, it's being associated with things like long COVID and stuff, but like directly associated with the semi-starvation state.
Yeah. Honestly, I didn't really have too much for this chapter. Otherwise, other than like fainting episodes were just so common in famine victims. But again, I guess like thinking about why sitting to standing, that's a stress. That's a stress on the body that
Right.
the body has to like be able to adjust to like new position in space, gravity, pressure dynamics, like all of that requires proper function and structure. So I personally haven't dealt much with fainting, but I know that in our first episode of this series where you talked about like your previous past, like you did deal with that.
Yeah, it's a pretty like nerve-wracking thing because you don't necessarily know when you're going to. And so like you can imagine just like going about your day to day or like driving, it becomes like, am I going to faint when I'm driving? And then like, what's that going to happen? What's going to happen there? I'm so glad I don't deal with that anymore because yeah, it's horrible. Like my experience of like syncope is like ringing in the ears, tunnel vision. You kind of get this like autonomic feeling of like your hands get clammy and wet and stuff. And then all of a sudden I would just go boom, like lights would be out. I would just hit the ground. But right when I hit the ground, it was almost like the blood flow returned to my head immediately and I would pop right back up again. I'd be like, what the heck? And then it would happen like repeatedly. So that was the worst part. In that case, like if you're experiencing that, please go see a doctor, first of all. But second of all, if it's like an acute situation and you're experiencing it, sit on a chair and bend forward with your head between your legs. That can help keep the blood into your head to help you like from passing out. The other thing is like, lay down and have your legs above your heart. That can also help as well. But please go see a doctor.
But that just goes back to the heart preserving itself in sacrifice of other organ systems where blood has to flow to.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a couple of quotes like from the men in the MSC for this chapter that I'll read. So they did tilt table tests, which people that are being worked up for dysautonomia and POTS and stuff, you're very aware of these things. They experienced all, kind of the gamut of results you get from tilt table tests when you have POTS.
So real quick, I didn't know what a tilt table test was, so I looked it up on YouTube. And you're essentially just on a hospital bed and they just like rotate you in various positions. And Kathleen, I'm not going to lie, it seems crazy to me that the body would struggle with something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, just going to show like any sort of disturbance from your, normal position is a challenge for the body to deal with.
Yeah. And again, like we are a pressure canister, right? Like there's pressure outside of us and we are maintaining the pressure inside of us compared to the pressure outside of us. And when we, are changing positions or we're changing, the vestibular system, proprioception, like all of that, like that input, that stress, we now have to deal with that in order to, provide structure against what's pushing in on us, basically. And when we can't do that, well, then you can see why things like blood pressure, heart rate, et cetera, will change. Okay, this is kind of a long quote, so just bear with me. If you need to stop me to talk about something, please let me know. So an almost universal complaint among the subjects in the Minnesota experiment was some degree of faintness immediately after standing up from a chair or bed. This was a very transitory phenomenon, which varied from a slight sensation of dizziness to a dimming of vision and quote-unquote blacking out. causing the subject to reach for a temporary support. That was me all the time. No one ever lost consciousness during these episodes. Reports of dizziness associated with change of posture were very numerous during the first 6 weeks of the restricted diet, but thereafter they decreased until there were very few complaints on this point during the last 6 weeks. So this was starvation 18 to 24. It was felt that the men learned to refrain from making a sudden transition to the vertical posture, and in this way helped to avoid bringing on symptoms. That was me too. I literally would like creep my way into standing and stuff. It is interesting to note that complaints of dizziness associated with the assumption of the upright posture increased during the early part of rehabilitation when the men began to feel more vigorous. These complaints disappeared as appreciable weight gains were made. A number of men reported sensations of faintness, lightheadedness, dizziness, and weakness, which were not associated with postural change. These symptoms tended to occur near the end of the starvation period, while the men were on their feet doing chores. In addition, a few men reported dizziness on waking up in the morning, so like vertigo, which disappeared after they got out of bed and moved around a little. Numbness and tingling in the extremities in situations where circulatory occlusion would not be expected, so like laying on your arms, for example, were reported on 1 or 2 occasions, and the men reported an episode of trembling after walking on the treadmill. So that basically covers everything.
Well, I think that these chapters 28, 29, 30, they can be scary, right? Because the heart literally keeps us alive. And so you can't, like, for someone dealing with some of these symptoms, it's hard to not be like, oh my gosh, something is very wrong with me.
Right.
So I guess there's like a difference in like, it's okay to go seek help, but also understand that like, there's also a reason why the body is doing this. And I think understanding the energy availability, being in a low energy availability state can help just provide some reasoning so that you don't feel hopeless or very, very concerned. Because I mean, some of these things are life-threatening.
Yeah. So some men had normal blood volumes. Some men had greater than normal blood volumes. There was a couple, or maybe only one, that had low blood volume. It does seem like increasing blood volume can help. This is, I think, one reason why people with dysautonomia, POTS, etc., they reach for things like salt and water to help to increase their blood volume. They believe that the blackouts were from loss of cerebral pressure, and then from temporary circulatory failure. So again, like if you're losing cerebral, so brain pressure, all these people right now that are dealing with intracranial hypertension issues, like so changes in the pressure in the brain or in the skull, basically, like all related to this as well. Let's see. And then they talk about there was one spontaneous syncope that occurred in the MSC, and the man was suffering from a severe cold. And so you need to be incredibly careful if you have any kind of cold or any kind of increased stress on you, especially when it comes to circulation, your heart, etc. So that's all.
Okay. Do you want to try to do chapter 30?
Yeah, we can do that. That sounds good.
I think that honestly, chapter 30 is pretty similar to chapter 28 in the messaging that there is irregularity happening in the heart. However, the EKG chapter 30, basically the EKG is just like a test to measure and record what's happening in the heart, the electrical activity. So it provides some like evidence, like, hey, like there's actually some changes in the electrical activity of the heart when someone is in this low energy availability state. And so they were able to kind of better characterize different patterns and what was changing. And I think there were some very interesting patterns that are just scream, the heart is just conserving energy. Like that's kind of the biggest thing that I saw out of this chapter. Obviously we can go through the points, but my biggest takeaway was just like the change in electrical activity. Like there's not enough stimulation coming in. There's no energy isn't being spent to optimize the function at all.
Yeah. So really fast with the electrocardiogram, you see the P wave, and that's the depolarization. So this is talking about, it's literally reading like the voltage of the heart. So you see the P wave, and that represents the depolarization of the atria. Then you have the QRS wave, that represents depolarization of the ventricles. And then you have the T wave, which represents repolarization of the ventricles. And so we have like pacemaker cells in the heart, require a ton of energy to keep the pace of your heart, to keep your heart beating correctly, right? And so you can imagine when you're in a low energy availability state, that's just not going to function correctly. And so, they see abnormal ECGs, They see arrhythmias, especially prolonged QT waves. How many people have QT issues nowadays that you hear about? You know,
Yeah.
they
Well,
see.
along the lines of the pacemaker, I thought a very interesting thing that they saw with MSE. So they did a lot of EKG with the MSE subjects in particular. They saw that decrease of the heart rate, which we've already talked about, was also associated with a narrowing of the range of the heart rate. So basically, the variability that you saw. So in the control group, the heart rate varied 14.7%, but then that variation reduced down to 8.1%. And so, you know, like you said, someone may think, okay, that's someone just like shrinking in size, right? But to me, that's just saying that there's so much less stimulus coming in that there's just overall less activity. So there's less variance in, especially, and it said the decrease in the range exceeded the decrease of the heart rate when it was expressed as a percentage.
Right.
So can you talk, what is QT interval? Can you let?
Yeah. So you have like the, maybe we can put a picture or something next to the screen or whatever. But if you like go to the Wikipedia page and, you know, look up electrocardiography, or just type ECG, EKG, you can see. So like you have the initial, you know, P wave, and then it kind of dips into the Q, and then it shoots up to the R, dips to the S, and then it comes back up again, and then it goes into the T wave. So
I asked ChatGPT, and it said the QV interval is the time it takes for the heart ventricles to electrically reset after each heartbeat.
Yeah, that's a good summary. Yeah,
I honestly didn't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know. But the most startling thing is that the authors of the MSE said QT prolongation is one of the most persistent EKG changes that they see after semi-starvation. So it is a long-term effect.
Yeah.
Some sort of, it's not necessarily damage, but it's improper functioning as a result of being in a low energy availability state is this QT elongation.
Yeah, they say the recovery of the T wave at recovery 12, so 12 weeks of recovery, is quite marked, while the QRS amplitude recovers much more slowly.
So what would somebody see to know that they have this prolonged QT wave?
Well, you would have to get an EKG to actually see this, but what, like an arrhythmia, for example, that would be like an indication that something is going on. So if you start like skipping beats or like having double beats, like all of that stuff, that would be indication. So
they also saw changes in something called the maximal inspiration. So these are all very fancy big terms, but it's basically just a way to characterize like how the heart is functioning with each breath, right? And so there's normal time stamps in between all of the phases. So like if you breathe in and you breathe out, like the heart is changing its speed, the electrical activity is changing throughout that, and there's very well documented patterns of how that's supposed to happen. And they saw the effect of maximal inspiration diminished for both like inhale and exhale parts of this phase. So maximal inspiration refers to the changes in the EKG when a person takes a deep breath. So during maximal inspiration, physiological changes affect the heart and its electrical activity, which they can then document on it. So I think that they were very surprised in seeing the changes in the maximal inspiration. But Kathleen, what do you think the main reason is for why like certain intervals like this are being changed or modified? Do you think it's more of like the electrical energy coming in or the atrophy of the heart?
So they say the decrease of the QRS and T wave amplitudes is probably the most remarkable change in the EKG in starvation. And so they propose the following factors: a decrease in heart size, myocardial degeneration, rotation of the heart around a transversal axis. So this kind of goes back to the positional change we were talking about with the stomach and the other organs. A decrease in metabolic rate, although there is no outright correlation between QRS amplitude and BMR, both QRS and T amplitudes are usually decreased in hypothyroidism and have a tendency to increase in hyperthyroidism. So that would be kind of the energetic component right there. Fluid accumulation. So again, back to the edema issue in the chest or pericardium. Although a considerable accumulation of body fluid associated with a tendency to edema was observed during semi-starvation, there was no clinical evidence for a major accumulation of fluid in the chest or pericardium. But of course, that possibility cannot be excluded, that minor amounts accumulated, which might have changed the electrical conductivity of the surrounding tissue. Because you have to remember, water is highly electrically conductive, right? And so even just a slight change in water could then change the electrical conductivity of the...
Something we talked about in the edema earlier is as the subjects got deeper into their semi-starvation, the percentage of water in their body went up.
Right.
So while they did start to definitely lose fat and muscle, the water percentage of the body started to go up.
Yeah.
And we see that very visually, like with edema at certain like extremities, but you can't really visually see that. Like, oh, my chest area has more fluid retention. Like that's not very visible, but that's going to change how the heart functions because like Kathleen said, like that affects electrical conduction. And yeah, so that again, just showing like this chapter, the heart is still functioning, but not functioning normally.
Right. And they say since both vagus effect and sympathetic response are diminished, the slow heart rate may be due to increased vagus tone and loss of sympathetic tone. This would agree well with another person's observations of the absence of emotional pulse rate changes in semi-starvation. And so like in different phases of semi-starvation, the way you respond to emotional stress will change. So like at the beginning, it seems like there's like an over response to emotional stress. And then as you progress down, there's like no response and you just kind of this like flat affect, like this kind of torpor like affect.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes a lot of energy to maintain this wonderful, beautiful, incredible structure inside of us. Like it's magnificent that our breath is controlled without us thinking about it.
Right.
But it takes a lot of energy and proper structure to do that.
Yeah. And so one of the MSc participants, so again, this is another reason that we need to go slow during refeeding. During the early rehabilitation period, his heart became enlarged and the venous pressure rose abruptly. They treated him with bed rest, reduced food intake, and diuretics to restore the patient. So again,
they had like imaging in the MSE showing like literally the heart would just like increase in size abruptly.
Right.
Yeah. But we talked about this last time with the stomach. So we discussed how because there's less energy in maintaining the right like structure and posture, organs and various compartments can start to like sag or like dip. And so they talk about the heart could rotate around. And so that's going to change electrical conductivity. It's also going to change like how it's oriented, right? Like at an angle, it's going to function differently than it being upright.
Yeah, they see it be more vertical than it's kind of more like tipped over a little bit in the chest.
Yeah. What questions does this arise from you?
Okay, well, more of like a practical question for somebody who might be experiencing something like this. Well, first, let's take a step back. So in the other episodes, we would always talk about how you don't have to be extremely underweight to be experiencing this. So this could be relevant in somebody who still has extra weight, extra fat.
Along those lines, someone that maybe have extra weight, have extra fat, and they see severe exercise intolerance, out of breath, like of course there's some level of just like physical fitness, but if they have extreme exercise intolerance, that could also be a sign of like poor circulation for them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You know, obviously, if you're starting from doing nothing and you're starting to move again and stuff, you need to build the capacity, and you shouldn't expect yourself to be able to go and like walk a mile or, even like you need to build up to that. But like if you've been, trying these things and you're still struggling like months later and you're slowly trying to increase your capacity and all that stuff, and it's still an issue, like maybe this is something to consider. And also too, like, again, we're always fighting against pressure dynamics. So it doesn't really matter if like, say you start off in what would be considered like a very large body, for example, and then you lose some weight and now you're what you would still consider to be a large body, but just smaller. well, your body has to adapt to those changes in pressure dynamics, right? And so again, like I just, you know, I think it's incorrect for people to believe that if they are overweight or they have a lot of, mass on them and stuff, that like this can't happen to you. Because in a way, like the kind of metabolic syndrome, overweight side of this, it's more we couldn't get those macros through the TCA and ETC. And so we just stored them because it's like, well, I whether it's I don't have the hemoglobin to get the carbon dioxide, to get the oxygen, or I don't have the like B1 and magnesium for pyruvate dehydrogenase, or I don't have the manganese and biotin for pyruvate carboxylase, like whatever it is, like for these things to come in, if you don't have sufficient amount of them, or you don't have sufficient amount of them when your macros are trying to come in and go through beta oxidation, electron transport chain, all of them, well then it's just your body's just going to store it. So that doesn't mean that you can't be in an LEA. And I think that's like a big misconception that people keep like missing, right? Is that you can be in a relative LEA, but be overweight. And anyway, in that case, like too, like now you have the inflammatory response of being overweight, and now your immune system and everything else has to deal with that. And so now you're using like more energy to deal with that. And it's like, where's that energy coming from? Yeah.
What was your practical question for that? I cut you off. Like what they should do.
What?
What they should do.
No. So talking about training then. So let's say different zones, training zones. There's the target heart rate zones for like zone 2, for example. And obviously that varies based on your age. And you can probably find a more specific calculator too. But taking the basic calculator, let's say somebody is coming out of a long-term undereating. So they weren't intentionally starving themselves, but now they're trying to do what we're saying and where they're increasing their calories, but they're not finding that they're able to get their heart rate into the appropriate zone when they're putting in the right amount of intensity to be in that zone. What is your suggestion as far as how to start incorporating these different zones, like zone 2, for example, but you're not able to get into that zone despite pushing yourself accordingly, provided that they're eating enough now?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I typically recommend before people try any zone 2 is get up to 6,000 steps per day. Make sure that you are able to do 6,000 steps per day. And once you're there, 8,000 would be better, but I think 6,000 is like a good threshold as you're continuing to work to 8,000. And then once you're there, try some zone 2. And so when it comes to like adapting to zone 2, you will adapt and it will become harder you'll have to either increase the pace, or if you're like using an incline treadmill, you have to increase the incline, like something like, I think Ash, you saw this like during your cut, right? Like as the endurance adaptations are happening, you have to push the intensity a little bit more in order to force the heart to go into the higher zones and stuff. That's a good thing, right? Because it means that the heart is getting stronger, it's adapting, all of that stuff. But if if you're trying those things and your heart is just not going into that place, like it can't take the intensity, then I would continue to just do lower intensity zone 1 work until you build up the capacity that, okay, now we can get into zone 2.
Could it be that like their relative zone 2 will, because of the state that their heart is in, that their actual percentage or zone that they're looking for, like let's say my zone 2 was 120 to 150, could it be that their zone 2 is technically lower?
Yeah, I think so. That the relative difference, like, so would you call that zone 2? Probably not, but you would say like, okay, look, if a normal quote unquote for your age, your size, etc., is a heart rate of about X, and your zone 2 would be a heart rate of about X, you kind of take the difference there and then you say, okay, my current heart rate is Y. I'm going to add that difference to my current heart rate and then say this is my quote unquote zone 2 for right now, or call it whatever you want, because people are going to be like, that's not real zone 2. Call it whatever you want. But like, this is your kind of higher level training. But, and I will just say though, like, if you're finding that it is that difficult to put yourself there, and if your heart rate is still that low, I wouldn't necessarily be concerning yourself with zone 2 right now. I would be, like I said, focus on getting steps in, push the steps a little bit, like make sure you're maintaining nasal breathing, but like try to make it a little bit difficult, a little bit intense on you. And then focus on kind of the refeeding side of things. And then once those things start to improve, then slowly add in things like a little bit more zone 1, zone 2, etc.
So thinking of this like person, and they have a very low resting heart rate, I would almost see what would happen if they started to do zone 2 would be the pendulum swing. So they would see their heart rate go super high because they're in that state of the heart is only adjusted to be able to work in this very narrow range. And when it's challenged beyond that, it swings in the opposite direction.
So the reason I asked is because I'm working with somebody in our course, and they're coming out of what would be, I would consider starvation calories for them, but they're at like 2,600 calories at this point, doing well, and losing weight. So having to continuously increase in small increments.
It's not amazing. Like
it is.
It's amazing.
It is. And they already do a lot of steps per day. And so I asked this because I'm personally trying to figure out, they do the Peloton bike, and yeah, they're having this situation where they're pushing themselves, but they can't get their heart rate to come up despite bringing up, digestion's doing well, their calories are up, their body weight, their metabolism is responding appropriately. So the heart rate seems like to be their lagging component in recovery. And it only became evident during the attempt to do zone 2 because resting heart rate seems to be fine. So I just thought that was interesting and relative to our conversation today, that it is lagging behind in recovery.
Yeah. Well, and based off of what they saw with the MSE men, it's going to take a while for the heart to recover. And so I think you're doing the right thing of, steps are great. Like we obviously don't want to keep just pushing steps up as high as possible. Like I think,
we're trying to actually bring them down.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for like the average person.
Some people need that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like 8 to 10,000, I think is good. Like obviously if you're going on vacation and you get like 15,000 because you're like seeing the sights and stuff, that's fine. But like I think for the average person, like 8 to 10,000 is a good goal. But yeah, if you're kind of pushing the zone 2 and it's not there, I still think you can push intensity, and especially if they're intuitively feeling like, yeah, I kind of want to jog today, maintaining nasal breathing, etc. I think that's great. And then I would also then kind of look at that relative correction of, okay, we're still getting the heart moving and stuff, but it just won't be as high. And I just go back to like what Ash said about the heart rate variability and stuff. You're just not going to see it go high or higher. And I would just say, like, I think it's good to push the intensity, assuming that it doesn't like crush the person. Like if they try it and they're like, oh my goodness, I remember like I was on a destroyer and we were out in the middle of the ocean, and I got up early one morning. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, I'm going to go run 6 miles on the treadmill, and the ship is like going in the ocean. So I'm like bobbing up and down the treadmill, and
no pain, no gain.
And I remember like crawling into my rack afterwards and just being like dead to the world. Like I was completely crushed, completely out, because I just could not handle any kind of that stress. And that probably was way too much to do at that time. So like if the person, tries it and they get crushed afterwards, I would hold off for a while. Like I say this in jest, but truly, like I would hold off for a while, and just kind of focus on, some other things. Like maybe this is the time to put on some quality muscle mass, for example. Keep those steps up or bring them down if need be. Still again, like when you're walking, like still push the intensity, but like don't like challenge your heart if it's like, no, I cannot go there right now.
Right. So I think this is what you were saying important. In the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, there was not full recovery of the EKG proper functioning at week 12 of the rehabilitation, and they didn't see any sort of complete return to control values until R24, and even then there was still things that were off. So that's basically what they said is the amount of time it took to shrink and disturb the heart function was less than the time that's going to require for it to build back up. And so I think, again, not giving false, like not trying to say you're broken, it's never going to be fixed, having realistic expectations and knowing doing zone 2 and various like cardio training is very beneficial to train the heart, but understand when you're in a place strong enough to be able to support that. once you've mastered 6,000 to 8,000 steps a day, eating at least 3 meals a day at regular intervals and enough that's to fuel you so that your body can have those resources and energy to return back to how it's supposed to function.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, maybe this is just time to focus on muscle building and getting stronger. And, we can test, I would test like every month or so, every 2 weeks, and see like, okay, does it seem like the heart is starting to respond a little bit? And then it's like, okay, yeah, we're seeing improvements on that and stuff. But I think it's important to like respect where the body is, and yeah,
Go slow.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Again, like I understand like that is such a hard thing for the psyche and mentally to grasp. Like I was talking to someone, to Libby, and I was like, in some ways, I think it's very helpful to be like pregnant and go through refeeding, because it's like we're growing a baby already. We're already accepting that we're gaining weight. Like we're already accepting that we're gaining like fluid and stuff like that. But that's obviously not a good reason to be pregnant, of course. But it's this entire thing from the psychological standpoint is a very difficult thing. And I very much understand that. So whatever you need to do to kind of address that, like please do it. Because I think that, again, even if this is not everything, get this right so you can support yourself in taking care of everything else.
This particular situation that I'm talking about is another example of somebody not recognizing that they're putting themselves in an LEA. Is that the reason I'm bringing this person's steps down is because their activity level was so high that they could not possibly be eating enough calories. So even if they weren't below that 2,000 mark,
right,
they were so active that they were in a LEA. So that's, again, like another scenario. You could be eating a ton of calories, but you could be the rare person who's literally like moving from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, and not be eating enough for your output. So there's a lot of different scenarios here.
Yeah, this is called Red S in like the literature. So it's relative energy deficiency of sport. So if you want to read up about that.
That was me.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people think, well, I'm not an athlete. I'm not training for the Olympics or anything, but it's like, but you're doing the same amount of work, maybe slightly less, but you're still doing the same amount of work as if you were. And so that you would still, what I would consider to fall under Red S. So
it's almost just as hard for these people to start doing less than it is for some people to start eating more.
Yes.
Because it's part of their routine.
Yeah.
So I understand if somebody's struggling to like I know some people with my friends who get like 20,000 steps a day, and they've had to really consciously work at not walking that much, because it's really hard to maintain that and eat enough calories to be able to walk that much, do everything else during the day, and be healthy.
Yeah.
So it is challenging, but it might be a factor for some people too.
Definitely. Yeah. And like, I don't think all is lost. Like eventually your body will increase its need. Like you'll start fidgeting, and like it'll increase its body heat and stuff like that. So you will continue to move. So it's not like you're going to put on, especially if you're going slow enough, it's not like you're going to put on all this weight. Like, yes, we might have to deal with the edema that comes on and some of the other stuff that comes on in the process. And yes, that does take some time to come off. And I think that is a really difficult thing, again, psychologically, but eventually it does come off. We just kind of have to persevere. So,
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Any final thoughts on LEA and heart cardiovascular function?
I think that's it. I think next time we have renal, special senses, so like our 5 senses, neuromuscular functions and motor performance, the capacity for work, and then hopefully we get to it too, sexual function. So that's the rest of the physiology chapters. And then from there we go on to psychology, which I think will be
volume 2.
Oh, great.
Yes, I think psychology will be very eye-opening for a lot of people too.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. All right, guys. Until next time, a few things, wrap-up points. Go slow. If you need help, don't hesitate to reach out, because could be like a really missing and important piece. And if there are any practitioners that are well-versed in this, please reach out to us. And number 3, like, all hope is not lost.
Exactly.
When the body has sufficient energy, it's amazing what it can restore. So, all right. Until next time, stay rooted in resilience.